The sledgehammer hit the basement floor of St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church with a resonant thud that seemed to echo through 50 years of silence. Detective Sarah Chen wiped the sweat from her forehead as she watched the construction crew carefully remove chunks of concrete, their movements deliberate and reverent, despite the grim nature of their task. It was March 15, 2023, and what had begun as a routine renovation to install new heating pipes was about to unearth secrets that would shatter the faith of an entire community. The sweet, cloying smell of decay mixed with decades of incense and old wood created an almost suffocating atmosphere in the cramped basement space beneath the altar. Chen had been a detective for 12 years, but something about this place made her skin crawl in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Father Michael Torino stood in the corner, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching the proceedings with an expression that Chen couldn't read. At 72, he had served St. Bartholomew's for nearly 3 decades, taking over from the previous pastor in 1995. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his black cassock was pressed and pristine, but Chen noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the way his eyes avoided the growing hole in the floor. "I keep thinking about how many masses I've said above this spot," he murmured to Chen, his voice barely audible over the sound of jackhammers. "How many times I've consecrated the Eucharist, believing I was standing on holy ground." The call had come in at 6:43 a.m. that Tuesday morning. Jimmy Kozlowski, a 60-year-old construction foreman with reliable renovations, had been using ground-penetrating radar to map the basement's infrastructure when he detected anomalies beneath the altar area. What appeared on his screen as rectangular shapes, roughly 4 feet in length, arranged in an orderly pattern about 6 feet below the concrete floor. "I've been doing this for 35 years, Kozlowski told Chen when she arrived on scene. "I know what bodies look like on GPR. These aren't ancient graves or forgotten burial plots. The concrete above them was poured sometime in the 70s, based on the composition and the way it's aged." Chen had immediately called for the crime scene investigation unit and contacted the archdiocese, knowing that any discovery in a Catholic church would require delicate handling. The media attention alone could destroy lives and institutions if not managed properly. She also requested the presence of Dr. Amanda Rivera, the county's chief forensic anthropologist, whose expertise in historical remains would be crucial for determining the age and circumstances of any discoveries. As they worked, Chen found herself studying the church's layout, noting how the altar area was elevated and partially enclosed, creating a natural barrier between the congregation and whatever lay beneath. The first glimpse of white fabric emerged at 11:27 a.m. Dr. Rivera, kneeling beside the excavation site with surgical precision, used a soft brush to clear away decades of accumulated debris. "We have clothing," she announced quietly, her voice carrying the weight of professional detachment that masked deeper emotions. "Appears to be a white garment, possibly liturgical in nature." Chen felt her stomach tighten as she watched Rivera work, each gentle stroke of the brush revealing more of what appeared to be a small cassock or altar server outfit. The fabric was remarkably well preserved, protected by the concrete and the cool, dry environment of the basement. As the hours passed, the excavation revealed a scene that would haunt Chen for the rest of her career. 3 small bodies, each wrapped in white altar server robes, arranged in what appeared to be a ritualistic pattern beneath the church's altar. The remains were positioned facing east, toward the rising sun, with their hands folded across their chests in a prayer-like pose. Personal effects found with the bodies included small wooden crosses, prayer cards featuring St. Bartholomew, and what appeared to be handwritten notes in children's handwriting. Dr. Rivera estimated the remains had been in place for approximately 50 years, which aligned with Kozlowski's assessment of the concrete's age. Chen immediately established a perimeter around the church and called for additional investigators. The discovery of what appeared to be child victims in a religious setting triggered protocols for both homicide investigation and potential institutional abuse cases. She contacted Detective Ray Morrison, a specialist in cold cases who had extensive experience with historical abuse investigations in religious institutions. Morrison, a burly man in his late 50s with gray stubble and tired eyes, had seen enough cases like this to know they were stepping into a minefield of legal, political, and emotional complications. The identification process began with missing persons reports from the 1970s. Chen and Morrison spent the evening of March 15th at the county records office, poring over yellowed files and microfilm records. The basement of the courthouse smelled like dust and old paper, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently as they searched through decades of missing child reports. "Look at this," Morrison said, pointing to a file dated October 12, 1973. Timothy O'Brien, age 11, last seen leaving St. Bartholomew's after evening mass. Parents reported him missing when he didn't come home for dinner. The boy's school photo showed a freckled face with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile that made Chen's chest tighten. Two more cases emerged from the records. Marcus Rodriguez, age 10, disappeared November 3, 1973, also last seen at St. Bartholomew's during altar server practice. And David Walsh, age 12, vanished December 18, 1973, after staying late to help prepare for Christmas services. All three boys had been altar servers at the church. All had disappeared within a span of just over 2 months, and all had been reported missing by frantic parents who never received answers about their children's fate. The pattern was unmistakable, yet somehow these connected disappearances had never been investigated as related cases. Chen contacted the families the next morning, a task that required delicate communication and support from victim services coordinators. Margaret O'Brien, now 78, lived in a modest ranch house on Elm Street, just 6 blocks from the church where her son had disappeared. When Chen and Morrison arrived at her door, they found a woman whose grief had crystallized into a kind of permanent fragility. Her living room was a shrine to Timothy, filled with photographs chronicling his brief life and the small soccer trophies he had earned before his disappearance. "I prayed every night for 50 years that someday I'd know what happened to my boy," she whispered, clutching a faded school photo. "I just never imagined it would be like this." The Rodriguez family had moved to Florida in 1985, unable to bear living in the same town where their son had vanished. Chen reached Elena Rodriguez by phone, and the woman's immediate sob upon hearing the news carried across the distance like a physical blow. "Marcus wanted to be a priest," Elena said through her tears. "He loved serving at the altar. He would practice the Latin responses in his bedroom, and he had this little wooden cross that he carried everywhere. Did you find his cross?" Chen confirmed that a wooden cross had been found with one of the bodies, though formal identification would take weeks through dental records and DNA analysis. David Walsh's parents had both passed away in the intervening decades, but his sister, Patricia Walsh Stevens, still lived in the area. At 65, she had spent her entire adult life wondering what happened to her younger brother. When Chen and Morrison met with her at her home on Pine Street, they found a woman who had channeled her grief into advocacy work for missing children. Her dining room table was covered with files, newspaper clippings, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies spanning 5 decades. "I never stopped looking," she said simply. "I knew someone had hurt David. The police back then acted like he was just a runaway, but David would never have left without telling me. We were very close." The investigation into the church's history revealed a complex web of administrative changes and carefully managed transfers. Father Edmund Krasinski had served as pastor of St. Bartholomew's from 1968 to 1975, during the period when the 3 boys disappeared. According to Archdiocese records, Krasinski had been quietly transferred to a parish in rural Montana in January 1974, ostensibly for health reasons. The timing was suspicious, coming just weeks after the 3rd boy's disappearance. Chen and Morrison requested Krasinski's personnel file from the Archdiocese, but were told that many older records had been lost in a fire at the diocesan offices in 1987. Morrison had seen this pattern before in cases involving institutional abuse. "They move the problem, they don't solve it," he explained to Chen as they drove to interview current church staff. "Transfer the priest, destroy the records, wait for people to forget or die. It's a system designed to protect the institution, not the victims." The Archdiocese's current leadership, under Archbishop Thomas Callahan, promised full cooperation with the investigation, but Chen noticed the careful legal language in their official statements and the presence of multiple attorneys at every meeting. The forensic evidence began to paint a picture of systematic abuse and murder. Dr. Rivera's preliminary examination revealed evidence of trauma to all 3 victims, including healed fractures consistent with physical abuse and signs of malnutrition suggesting prolonged captivity. More disturbing were indications that the children had been alive for some time after their initial disappearances, based on the advanced state of some healed injuries. "These children didn't die immediately," Rivera explained to Chen in her sterile laboratory at the county morgue. The pattern of injuries suggests they were held somewhere, possibly for weeks or months, before being killed. The basement beneath the altar showed signs of modification that dated to the early 1970s. A hidden room, accessed through a concealed door behind the furnace, contained evidence of long-term occupation. Old mattresses, chains attached to the walls, and children's clothing in various sizes. The room was ventilated through a system that connected to the church's main air circulation, ensuring that any sounds from below would be masked by the normal activities above. Chen found herself imagining those three boys trapped in this underground chamber, while masses were conducted overhead, their families praying desperately for their safe return just feet above their heads. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone had suspected. The remains belonged to Timothy O'Brien, Marcus Rodriguez, and David Walsh. The news broke on April 3, 2023, sending shockwaves through the community and beyond. St. Bartholomew's had been a cornerstone of the neighborhood for over a century, and many parishioners struggled to reconcile their faith with the horrific crimes that had taken place beneath their feet. Some left the church entirely, while others rallied around Father Torino and the current congregation, insisting that the sins of the past should not destroy the good work being done in the present. The search for Father Edmund Krasinski led investigators across the country. They discovered that he had served in parishes in Montana, Oregon, and finally, New Mexico before his death in 1998. At each location there were reports of behavioral problems and concerns about his interactions with children, but no formal charges had ever been filed. The pattern suggested a systematic cover-up by church authorities, who had chosen to move the problem rather than address it. Chen found herself frustrated by the realization that Krasinski had lived free for 24 years after committing these crimes, dying peacefully in his sleep at a retirement home for priests in Santa Fe. The investigation expanded to examine other potential victims. Chen and Morrison established a tip line and began reviewing missing persons cases from Krasinski's other parish assignments. They discovered at least 6 additional cases of missing or abused children that showed similar patterns. Altar servers who had disappeared or made accusations against Krasinski before being transferred to foster care or sent to live with relatives in other states. Many of these victims were now adults, and tracking them down required patient detective work and sensitive outreach through victim advocacy organizations. Thomas Brennan, now 48 and living in Seattle, had been an altar server at St. Joseph's Parish in Montana during Krasinski's tenure there from 1974 to 1981. When Chen reached him by phone, the initial silence stretched so long that she thought the call had been disconnected. "I tried to tell someone once," he finally said, his voice hollow with old pain. "My parents didn't believe me. They said I was making up stories to get attention. Father Krasinski was so respected in the community, and I was just a troubled kid from a broken home." Brennan had spent decades in therapy, struggling with addiction and relationship problems that he traced back to the abuse he suffered as a child. The legal implications of the case were complex, given the age of the crimes and the death of the primary suspect. The district attorney's office worked closely with Chen and Morrison to determine what charges, if any, could be filed against surviving church officials who might have enabled or covered up Krasinski's crimes. The statute of limitations had long since expired for most potential charges, but newer laws regarding institutional liability and conspiracy to conceal crimes offered some possibilities for holding the church accountable. Cardinal Patrick McMahon, who had served as auxiliary bishop during the relevant time period and was still alive at age 89, became a person of interest in the investigation. McMahon, now retired and living in a Catholic retirement community in Arizona, had been responsible for priest assignments and had personally approved Krasinski's transfers. When Chen and Morrison traveled to interview him, they found a man whose memory seemed conveniently selective when it came to details about problematic priests under his supervision. Father Krasinski was a troubled man, McMahon admitted during the recorded interview in the sterile conference room of his retirement facility. "We tried to help him with counseling and spiritual direction, but we may not have fully understood the extent of his problems." When pressed about the timing of Krasinski's transfers and whether they were related to complaints about inappropriate behavior, McMahon's responses became evasive. "We did what we thought was best at the time," he repeated several times, his rheumy eyes avoiding direct contact with the investigators. The community's response to the revelations was complex and divided. Some parishioners supported the current church leadership and emphasized the need for healing and forgiveness. Others demanded accountability and joined lawsuits against the archdiocese, seeking damages for the cover-up of Krasinski's crimes. The church building itself became a focal point of controversy. with some calling for its demolition, while others argued for its preservation as a memorial to the victims. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma therapist specializing in childhood sexual abuse, began working with survivors and family members affected by the case. Her office on Main Street became a refuge for people struggling to process the revelation that their trusted spiritual community had harbored such darkness. "The betrayal is often worse than the original trauma," she explained to Chen during one of their consultations. These families had faith not just in God, but in the institution that was supposed to protect their children. Learning that the institution actively concealed the danger feels like a second victimization. Margaret O'Brien found herself at the center of a media storm that she was ill-equipped to handle. Reporters camped outside her modest home, seeking quotes and reactions to each development in the case. Chen arranged for victim services to provide support and media training, but O'Brien struggled with the attention. "I just want people to remember Timothy as the sweet boy he was," she told Chen during one of their meetings. "He loved baseball and had this laugh that could fill a room. He's not just a victim in a news story. He was my son, and he had a whole life ahead of him that was stolen." The Archdiocese announced a compensation fund for victims and their families, but many saw this as an attempt to limit legal liability rather than genuine remorse. The fund required victims to waive their right to sue the church, which most of the affected families rejected. "Money can't bring back our children," Elena Rodriguez said during a press conference organized by the victims' families. "We want accountability. We want to make sure this never happens to anyone else's child." The investigation revealed that warning signs about Krasinski had been present from the beginning of his career. Seminary records showed that he had been flagged for inappropriate behavior with younger seminarians and had undergone psychological evaluation before his ordination. The evaluation, conducted by church-affiliated psychologists, had recommended additional monitoring and counseling but had not prevented his ordination. Chen found herself wondering how many children might have been saved if the church had taken these early warnings seriously. Father Torino announced his decision to step down as pastor of St. Bartholomew's in May 2023, citing the emotional toll of the investigation and his desire to allow the community to heal. His farewell mass was attended by hundreds of parishioners, many of whom credited him with helping them maintain their faith during the darkest period in the church's history. "Father Torino wasn't responsible for what happened," said longtime parishioner Mary Kelly. "He's been nothing but honest and supportive throughout this whole nightmare. Losing him feels like losing another piece of our church family." The physical renovation of the church took on symbolic importance as the community grappled with how to move forward. The basement was completely reconstructed, with the hidden rooms sealed and filled with concrete. A memorial garden was created on the grounds, featuring 3 oak trees planted in honor of Timothy, Marcus, and David. The altar area was reconsecrated in a ceremony that drew both supporters and protesters, reflecting the deep divisions within the Catholic community about how to address the church's history of abuse. Chen's investigation expanded to include a review of the original missing persons investigations from 1973. She discovered that the 3 cases had been assigned to different detectives and had never been connected, despite the obvious similarities. Detective Frank Kowalski, who had handled Timothy O'Brien's disappearance, was now retired and living in Florida. When Chen interviewed him by phone, she found a man who had been haunted by the case for 50 years. "I knew something wasn't right," he admitted. 3 altar boys disappearing from the same church in 2 months? But my sergeant said we couldn't jump to conclusions, and the church was putting pressure on the department not to create a panic. I've regretted not pushing harder every day since then. The revelation that local law enforcement had been influenced by church pressure added another layer to the scandal. Police records from the period showed numerous interactions between church officials and department leadership, including donations to police charities and invitations to church events for officers and their families. While there was no evidence of explicit corruption, the cozy relationship between the institutions had clearly affected the investigation's thoroughness. Morrison's experience with similar cases proved invaluable as the investigation moved into its final phases. He had worked on the infamous Boston Archdiocese scandal in the early 2000s and understood the patterns of institutional cover-up that enabled predatory priests. "The church's first instinct is always to protect itself," he explained to Chen as they prepared their final report. "They hire the best lawyers, they destroy or hide evidence, and they use their moral authority to shame victims into silence. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even after 50 years. The formal charges announced in June 2023 included conspiracy and accessory after-the-fact charges against 2 retired church officials who had been involved in covering up Krasinski's crimes. Cardinal McMahon was deemed too frail for prosecution, but Monsignor Robert Flynn, who had served as chancellor during the relevant period, was arrested at his home in Vermont. At 76, Flynn maintained his innocence, but faced the possibility of spending his remaining years in prison for his role in enabling Krasinski's crimes. The trial preparations revealed the extent of the church's document destruction efforts. Entire files relating to problematic priests had been systematically destroyed, often under the direction of church lawyers who claimed attorney-client privilege. Chen and Morrison worked with federal prosecutors to explore RICO charges against the archdiocese as a criminal enterprise, but the complex legal issues and the age of the crimes made such charges difficult to prove. Patricia Walsh Stevens became a powerful advocate for other victims and their families, using her 5 decades of experience navigating the system to help others find their voices. She testified before a state legislative committee investigating institutional abuse and helped draft new laws extending the statute of limitations for childhood sexual abuse cases. David's death wasn't meaningless if it helps protect other children, she said during her testimony. We can't bring back our babies, but we can make sure the people who hurt them and covered it up are held accountable. The psychological impact on the broader community extended far beyond the directly affected families. Many parishioners struggled with their faith, questioning how a loving God could allow such evil to flourish in his house. Support groups formed spontaneously, bringing together people who had never spoken about their doubts and fears. Dr. Martinez found herself counseling not just direct victims, but hundreds of community members dealing with spiritual trauma and the collapse of their trust in religious authority. The investigation's conclusion in September 2023 brought mixed emotions for everyone involved. Chen and Morrison had solved a 50-year-old cold case and brought some measure of justice to the victims' families, but the deaths of both the perpetrator and most of the enablers meant that full accountability remained elusive. The surviving families found some peace in finally knowing what had happened to their children, but the knowledge that those children had suffered for months before their deaths added a new dimension to their grief. The civil lawsuits against the archdiocese continued for months after the criminal investigation concluded. The church ultimately agreed to a settlement of $15 million divided among the victims' families and survivors of abuse at Krasinski's other parishes. More importantly, the settlement included requirements for transparency in future abuse investigations and independent oversight of the church's child protection policies. Chen found herself profoundly changed by the case. The mother of 2 young children herself, she struggled with nightmares and anxiety that required professional counseling. The image of those 3 small bodies beneath the altar haunted her dreams, and she found it difficult to enter any church without thinking about what might be hidden beneath its floors. Her marriage survived the stress of the investigation, but it required work and understanding from her husband, who watched helplessly as the case consumed her thoughts and emotions. The church building itself stood as a complex symbol when the investigation finally concluded. Some community members had pushed for its demolition, arguing that the structure was irredeemably tainted by the crimes committed within its walls. Others insisted that the building could be reclaimed and purified, that allowing evil to destroy a century-old community landmark would give the perpetrators a final victory. In the end, the church remained standing, but attendance never returned to previous levels. St. Bartholomew's was eventually merged with a neighboring parish, and the building was converted into a community center offering services for victims of childhood trauma. The Memorial Garden became a place of pilgrimage for people dealing with loss and betrayal, and the 3 oak trees grew strong and tall, their roots reaching deep into soil that had once concealed unspeakable secrets. The case had ripple effects throughout the Catholic Church's handling of abuse allegations. The detailed documentation of how warning signs had been ignored and crimes covered up became a textbook example of institutional failure. Seminaries began using the Krasinski case as a teaching tool for recognizing and reporting concerning behavior, and victim advocacy groups pointed to it as evidence of why independent oversight of religious institutions was necessary. For the families of Timothy O'Brien, Marcus Rodriguez, and David Walsh, the conclusion of the investigation marked not an ending, but a new beginning. After 50 years of not knowing, they finally had answers, graves to visit, and the knowledge that their children's deaths had led to changes that might protect other families. Margaret O'Brien, now 80, found peace in tending the memorial garden and sharing stories about her son with visitors who came to pay their respects. The three altar boys who had answered what they believed was God's call to service had indeed been under the altar since 1973, but their story had finally been told. Their voices, silenced for half a century, had spoken through the careful work of investigators who refused to let their deaths remain hidden. In death, they had become witnesses to the truth, their discovery serving as a powerful reminder that no institution, no matter how revered, is above accountability for the protection of children. The investigation officially closed on October 15, 2023, exactly 50 years and 3 days after Timothy O'Brien's disappearance. Chen and Morrison submitted their final report, a 847-page document that would serve as a template for future investigations into institutional abuse. The case had consumed 18 months of their lives and left both investigators fundamentally changed, but they had succeeded in giving 3 lost children their names back and ensuring that their deaths would not be forgotten. In the end, the story of Timothy, Marcus, and David became more than a tale of tragedy and institutional failure. It became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of believing victims, and the truth that justice, even delayed by decades, can still honor the memory of the innocent dead. Their legacy lived on in strengthened laws, improved policies, and the determination of survivors and advocates to ensure that no other children would suffer the same fate in silence and darkness beneath the places where communities gathered to worship and trust.